Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, and even good morning, I dare say, looking at from where you're all tuning in today. A warm welcome to this webinar or this virtual session meeting the author Thomas Harder and the story of Anders Lassen, the Special Forces hero. We're really pleased to see so many of you tuning in. My name is Gunnar Larsen. I'm the director of the Danish-UK Association, and together with the Anglo-Danish Society, we're really pleased that we could put this event together and bring the story to you directly. And without the strong support of the many partners who have helped to spread the message here, and let me just mention a few of them, but there's a lot more than this. The Danish-Scottish Society, the Danske Kvinder i England, Danish Garters in the UK, the Danish Church in Hull as well in London, and of course Pen and Sword, the publishers behind, and so many more private individuals have helped to spread the message about this event, and it really shows in terms of who have now tuned in. So really pleased with that, and thank you very much for joining in today. Briefly, this session will be recorded. To many of you, this is probably a new system. It's not Zoom, it's not Teams, it's purely a web browser, and it is fully automated. So in a couple of hours after the presentation, you will, to the same email you received first time when signing up, be able to click through and see the recording and enjoy it later, or share it with friends who may want to see it as well. For any questions you may have to Thomas, Wayne here and I will help to curate the questions as much as possible. We may try to amalgamate a few of them if it makes sense. If we don't make them all, we'll try to follow up afterwards as much as possible. But moving on, let me introduce you to Wayne. I mentioned briefly, Wayne Harber is the chairman of the Anglo-Danish Society. He is not only well placed in that sense, but he at the same time has also have over 33 years in Her Majesty's Armed Services in various placements. He has been bestowed with an OBE, and he has also been bestowed with the Commander of the Order of Dannebrog from the Danish Queen back in 2013. So he is well placed to be the moderator today. And with that, Wayne, can I ask you to take it from here, please?
Gunnar, thank you very much indeed. And good evening, everyone. And I'd like to say a particular warm welcome to members of the Lassen family who have joined us for tonight's webinar, but also to everyone who's joining us not only throughout the United Kingdom, including Belfast, but also across into Denmark and a number of countries around Europe, including Turkey, Wayne Harber, as well as across the United States and all the way down under to Australia. So you're all very welcome for tonight's webinar. And it is a fascinating subject. And I'm sure that you will have read the biography that we had about tonight's speaker, Thomas Harder. But I wanted to highlight the fact that he has published about 20 works on Italian subjects, as well as 4 World War II biographies, and has received a number of awards for those works. And we are very grateful that he's been able to give up the time from Copenhagen to join us tonight to talk about his new book about Anders Lassen. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Thomas, who will take us through the story. Thank you, Thomas.
Colleagues at the associations and to all the various partners who have made this event possible. I've been looking forward to it very much. Anders Lassen is an important figure in Denmark's World War II history. Last year, the 100th anniversary of his birth was commemorated at the Memorial Cemetery in Copenhagen, where the heroes of the Danish resistance are honored. Among those present were the commanding officers of the Danish Army and Navy Special Forces, the chief of the Danish Special Operations Command, a representative of the Danish Home Guard, and so forth. But Lassen is not just a piece of Danish history, so present were also the British Defence Attaché and the Italian ambassador. By the way, the lady in the red coat on the edge of the image is Anders Lassen's sister, Bente Bernstorff, whom I believe is with us this evening. Hello, Bente. Now, a number of books exist already about Lassen in Danish and in English and Norwegian, and he's mentioned more or less in detail in most books on the British Special Forces of World War II. So you might ask, do we really need another book about him? And without false modesty, I believe that I can say that my book is different in a number of useful ways. For one thing, with all due respect for my predecessors, it's the first book on Lassen that has been written by a trained historian. It's also the first one that really attempts to place Lassen's individual story within the larger strategic and political context of World War II. You might say the micro story as part of the macro story. And furthermore, and this is of course very, very important, I have had access, because I've written at a much later date, I have had access to material, to sources that were not available to my various predecessors. Recent research and memoirs of all kinds, but first and foremost to literally thousands of files from British, German, Italian and Greek archives. My interest in Lassen began in earnest in April 2002 when I happened to be invited to Comacchio in northern Italy to participate in the inauguration of a monument to Lassen and to his three comrades, Hughes, Roberts and Crouch, who were killed with him the night between the 8th and 9th of April 1945. And it's important to note that the monument being inaugurated here is not a Danish or a British monument. It's a monument erected by the town of Comacchio to express gratitude to the men who, as it says on the plaque, at this location, far from their homelands, let down their lives for the freedom of the peoples. Being there, meeting the British veterans who participated in the ceremony, Lassen's comrades, some of them, his former commander, Lord Jellicoe, and even a local fisherman who had sailed with Lassen, hearing them speak about what they had been through right there where we were talking, hearing them tell their stories in such a uniformly low-key and unassuming way made a very strong impression on me, as did seeing the landscape where they fought and where Lassen and his three comrades and many more died. There were a couple of other books that I had to write before being ready for Lassen, so the first Danish edition of my book on him wasn't published until 2010. In many ways, I've been working on it ever since, and the fourth edition, which came out in 2020, and which is the basis of the English version, is much improved. I said that one of my reasons for writing a book about Lassen was simply curiosity. And Lassen is in some respects a mythical figure, a larger-than-life character known and admired by all sorts of people in different countries, and very much so in Denmark, but not only there. And by mythical, I mean that to many people, he seems to be a character outside of history, a bit like, you might say, King Arthur, or the heroes and villains of the American West, or perhaps more aptly, like the Homeric heroes, to whom he was often compared by the classically schooled British officers who wrote about him in their memoirs. A character you can interpret in all sorts of ways and tell all sorts of stories about, and whom you can use as a symbol for various things. A symbol of patriotism, of Denmark's fighting spirit, or of Denmark's lack of fighting spirit, and so forth. Now, I have nothing against mythical figures as such, but I wanted to take Lassen out of the realm of myth and put him back into history. Another good reason to write about Lassen was that, like most biographies, it was a chance to explore the world, or rather the various and very varied worlds in which he lived and acted. I said that I wanted to take Lassen out of the mythical sphere and place him in a historical context. Lassen was a man of flesh and blood. He was neither a saint nor a killing machine, as some have described him. Sometimes he was a gentleman, very often he was not. He could be very charming, and he could be extremely coarse. He said things about women, about foreigners and non-European people, and he did things which would not be acceptable today, and which were noticed and remarked on by the men around him, which tells me that he sometimes went beyond what was acceptable even in his own time and in his own circles. But I had no desire for Lassen or for his story to be in any particular way. I wasn't looking for a nice and kind Lassen or for a particularly hard or coarse or cruel Lassen. I was simply trying to find out what he was like, how he lived, what he did, under what sorts of conditions he did it, and not least why he did it, and why he kept doing it for 5 years, and what doing it did to him. Because there's no doubt, obviously, that the man who died at Comacchio on the 9th of April 1945 was not the same man who 5 years earlier decided that this was his war. Anders Lassen grew up in a landowning family with a strong military tradition and a very patriotic outlook. Lassen's sister told me that, and I quote, patriotism was in the air we breathed, along with the idea that one had a duty to lay down one's life for one's country in case of need. Anders and his brother Franz, who is with him here in the canoe, Lassen on the left of the picture, of course, the tall guy, and Franz is the little one with the fishing rod or the bow or whatever it is. Anders and Franz grew up with a degree of freedom and autonomy which I think is hard to imagine for modern parents. They spent as much time as possible in the woods around the family's home, the estate of Bækkeskov, and Anders and also Franz were great hunters. Anders was a crack shot with all sorts of guns and with homemade bows and arrows. He was fast on his feet, he was strong and fearless, sometimes reckless, and he developed a great sense of terrain. He got very good at moving silently and invisibly and at making snap decisions. By the way, Anders' younger brother Franz actually deserves a book all by himself. He joined Anders in England in 1942. He was recruited by the SOE and participated in cross-channel raids before being parachuted back into Denmark to work with the resistance. But back to Anders. Anders was gifted in many ways, but he was not academically gifted. After spending a couple of unhappy years at the public school Herlufsholm, he finished his schooling at a local lower secondary school where he just barely managed to pass the final exams. He then spent just one term at a physical education academy before dropping out, which left him with the question, what now? Anders could have chosen to do his national service at that point, but he wasn't interested in being a soldier, and so he postponed it. Instead, he went to sea as a cabin boy, not because he wanted to, but because that was the job he could get. He found the work of a sailor dull and dirty and without prospects, and he wrote as much in his letters home. Sailing is shit, he wrote. Nevertheless, he went back to sea after an Easter holiday at home, this time on the tanker Eleonora Maersk, a larger and more modern ship than Phaonia, and this time apparently enjoying it a bit more. He wrote lots of letters home. The letters tell of his pride in doing a good job and of being recognized for it. He obviously had, like most other people have, and like especially young people have, a need to be seen and to prove himself. Anders' letters are also interesting because they seem to be written without any sort of filter. He used the same language and he told the same stories, no matter whom he wrote to his friends, to his parents, or to his grandmother, the Dowager Countess. The letters are full of the same saucy, sometimes violent stories and the same very direct language. The letters show intelligence, they show a sense of humor, a sense of irony, and also of self-irony. You'll see on this slide that Anders' time on Eleonora Maersk is divided, I think, into two parts. but not by the outbreak of war in September 1939, but by the German occupation of Denmark on the 9th of April 1940. Anders' letters from September 39 to April 40 show no interest whatsoever in the war. He never wrote about Hitler, he never wrote about Poland or about the Jews or about anything to do with the war, apart from that when he sailed in what was classified as war waters, he got a higher pay. But apart from that, the war didn't interest him. But the occupation of Denmark on the 9th of April 1940 made a difference. It made the war personal for him. And so Lassen joined a mutiny which forced the master of Eleonora Maersk to hand over his ship to the British. And Lassen and most of the remaining crew sailed under British flag until October 1940, when he got a job on a tanker bound for Scotland from South Africa, and he arrived in Scotland around Christmas 1940. In Britain, Lassen was recruited by the Danish section of the Special Operations Executive. He spent a lot of time at various special training schools around Britain, learning the theory of sabotage and guerrilla work. He didn't enjoy schools in classrooms, but he did enjoy the paramilitary training at Arseek House in Scotland, and he excelled at it. It was a sort of extension, I suppose, of his hunting in the woods around Bækkeskov. However, Lassen was not secret agent material. One of his superiors at the school wrote about him, "He is keen enough on the job, but he cannot stand being kept in. He would definitely not be reliable enough for special duties. He might not keep sober when on leave, and he might give away secrets." On the other hand, Lassen was certainly not suited for conventional regimental military work. And so instead, he was posted to an outfit called the Maid Honor Force. The Maid Honor Force was one of the several private armies that were set up, mostly in the early part of the war, by people with ideas and initiative and the right sort of connections. Maid Honor Force was based on the Brixham cutter Maid Honor, which was bought for SOE funds by Gustavus March Phillips, the officer on the right of the photo of the Maid Honor with the moustache and no cap. The purpose of Maid Honor Force was to carry agents across the channel, to carry out sabotage and to ambush German vessels with all sorts of very inventive secret weapons on board the Maid Honor. However, this was not allowed by the Royal Navy or by the MI6, who didn't want amateurs making trouble in the channel. Instead, the Maid Honor was sent, of all places, to Sierra Leone in West Africa to hunt for German radio stations, listening posts, U-boat bases, and so forth. At least that was the idea. The voyage from Poole in Britain to Sierra Leone in West Africa lasted approximately 40 days, and Lassen's seamanship proved very valuable. As it turned out, however, the SOE office in Lagos, which was in control of operations in that part of the world, had no real use for Maid Honor. Not any use for the ship, that is. The men on board came in very handy. The Maid Honor Force, Lassen and his comrades, were employed in a thing called Operation Postmaster, which was the cutting out, which simply means the hijacking, of the Italian passenger and cargo ship Duchessa d'Aosta and the smaller German ship Licomba, which had gone into hiding in the neutral Spanish port of Santa Isabel on the island of Fernando Po off the Cameroons. Now, Operation Postmaster is a really wonderful story, which I tell in some details in the book. However, I'm afraid we don't have time to go into it really this evening, so you'll just have to buy the book and read about it. But Lassen once again distinguished himself. during the actual cutting out, the taking of Duquesa d'Aosta, and also on the voyage between Lagos, where the operation was based, and to Fernando Po. His seamanship and his resolute action saved one of the 2 tugboats carrying the postmaster force from going under in a storm. After the operation, Lassen was promoted to lieutenant by March Phillips, who had absolutely no authority to promote anybody to anything, but the promotion was confirmed by the military authorities later on, and so after postmaster, Anders Lassen was an officer of the British Army. Lassen spent a couple of months after postmaster in Nigeria training local tribesmen for guerrilla warfare. He enjoyed it in the sense that he enjoyed the freedom, he enjoyed the hunting, he enjoyed being on his own, having no real superiors to tell him what to do, but he was also sorry that there were no Germans for him to kill. That was what he wanted to do. He was driven by a strong anger with Germany and the Germans who had taken his country, and he wanted to fight them. And so, although he was in the process of buying a wife for some gin and a sum of money, he gladly accepted a posting back to Britain to rejoin the Maid Honor Force. The Maid Honor Force had been transformed and expanded into the small-scale raiding force, also known as No. 62 Commando, which carried out raids on the Channel Islands, which had been occupied by the Germans, and on northern France. The purpose of these raids, which were carried out at night time and lasted a couple of hours each time, was to simply show that Britain was fighting at a time when Britain couldn't do much else than try to build up forces and hope for the best. Also, the purpose was reconnaissance, to look at possible landing sites for future invasion operations, and to gather intelligence, to take German prisoners for interrogations, and perhaps first and foremost deception, to make the Germans believe, that is, that an invasion was imminent at a time when it certainly was not, in order for them to keep large forces along the Atlantic coast and the English Channel, instead of sending them to the Eastern Front, where they might have done the Germans more good. Also, to make the Germans look closely and intently at northern France and forget about North Africa, where the Allies were preparing to land in November 1942. During these operations, which were difficult and dangerous, Lassen proved very active, very resourceful, and very courageous. And during one of these raids, he killed a man for the first time. In December 1942, Lassen got his first military cross for Operation Postmaster and for his activities with a small-scale raiding force. The motivation is kept in a very vague language to, I suppose, to mask what went on Fernando Po, which was, of course, highly illegal and politically very sensitive. In February 1943, Anders Lassen and another officer, Lieutenant Pinkney, were sent from Britain to Egypt to help David Stirling train a seaborne squadron for the Special Air Service. But just before Lassen and Pinkney arrived in Egypt, Stirling was taken prisoner by the Germans. And this resulted in something of a crisis for the SAS. The seaborne squadron, which was hardly formed by that time, broke out and turned into an autonomous unit, which had various names: the Special Boat Section, the Special Boat Squadron, the Special Boat Service. Let's just call it SBS. The SBS was led by 2 really remarkable officers: George Jellicoe, its commanding officer, a man of great initiative, great charm, and great diplomatic abilities, a great planner, a man who could make things happen and inspire his men. And David Sutherland, a Scottish officer, was a professional officer with more of a military experience than Jellicoe had, who kept things together. and worked remarkably well with Jellicoe. And look at those men's ages. They were extremely young. George Jellicoe was a brigadier general by the end of the war, and Sutherland was, if I remember correctly, a lieutenant colonel. It always amazes me how young these people were. The first major operation carried out by the new amphibious force, SBS, was an attack on 3 different German airfields on Crete. The raiders were landed from the sea on the south coast of Crete and marched across the mountains to their respective targets. Lassen led the attack on Castelli Pediada in the northeastern end of Crete. And this was the most dramatic of the 3 attacks, as Lassen and his men got into a violent firefight with German and Italian guards. None of the 3 patrols succeeded in doing any real significant damage. Lassen believed that his attack had destroyed 8 German planes when it had actually just damaged a single one. But the whole operation was nevertheless a success in the sense that it was an important piece of deception, because together with a similar operation on Sardinia and together with other deception operations of various kinds, it served to mask the invasion of Sicily, which would take place in early July 1943, and make the Germans warlike, as it were, make them look at the 2 ends of the Mediterranean, Sardinia and Greece, instead of looking at Sicily, where they should really be looking and preparing. For Operation Albumen, Lassen received his 2nd military cross. On the 25th of July, Mussolini was removed from power, and on the 8th of September, Italy capitulated. Britain tried to secure the Italian islands in the Aegean before the Germans could do it, but unsuccessfully, because the British had insufficient forces. The SBS were among the small forces thrown around among the islands, trying to hold back the Germans, and forced out of the Aegean eventually, forced back to Castellorizo on the extreme right of the map, and forced back to Cyprus outside of the map. Simi, Leros, and Samos were some of the notable battles in this campaign, and in all 3 cases, the SBS ended up fighting defensive battles as infantry, not what they were trained for and not what their mindset made them suited for. Lassen particularly distinguished himself on Simi, where the SBS and some Italian troops fought off a German force that landed on the island looking for a radio transmitter operated by the long-range desert group and Greek resistance, and not expecting to find British troops on the island. Lassen was involved in very close combat on Simi, probably hand-to-hand, and using his knife. He showed exceptional courage, endurance, determination, and, wrote his commanding officer, an exceptional ability to read the terrain. Lassen was decorated with the Military Cross for the 3rd time after Simi, and in the foreword to my book, General Mark Carlton Smith notes that Lassen was one out of only 24 officers who received the Military Cross 3 times during the war. After the unsuccessful attempt to capture the Aegean islands before the Germans could do it, the SBS finally came into their own as raiders, waging a guerrilla warfare against the Germans from bases on the Turkish coast. That was what they did best, and what Lassen did best, and what he seemed to enjoy the most. Again, the job was primarily to gather intelligence and deception, to create and maintain an illusion of an imminent attack on Greece involving large British and Turkish forces, which of course never happened. The purpose was to tie down German forces in the Aegean, to keep them on the islands instead of having them move, for instance, to France, where they might be a problem for the Normandy landings, which were being prepared up through the beginning of 1944. The operations, as I said, were based on the coast of neutral Turkey, and the transport was provided by the Levant schooner flotilla, which was a small fleet of Greek schooners and other small craft disguised as Greek fishing boats or merchant shipping, which ferried the SBS back and forth between the Turkish coast and the various Greek islands. Present-day researcher has written in an article, which unfortunately I read only after having written my book, that special forces are defined by a fusion of technologies, mainly in the fields of communication, firepower, and transport. This is, I think, fairly easy to understand when one thinks about today's special forces with all their advanced equipment, but perhaps less obvious when we think about World War II. But the SBS and the SAS and the Long Range Desert Group and the rest of them also brought together a number of technologies that were, at the time, new, little used and modern. And they used them in higher concentration and they used them in combination. This gave them great mobility, great firepower, and the ability to penetrate far behind enemy lines and to operate autonomously for long periods of time. But it wasn't just a matter of technology, of course, far from it. It all came down to the men. Dick Holmes, who's the tall gentleman at the center of the screen, described himself and his comrades in the SBS as a bunch of arrogant bastards. They all knew that they were superior to their enemies, and they felt also very much superior to other British forces. They were motivated by a strong sense of comradeship and a sense of being different from the rest of the British Army. Patriotism doesn't come up very often in accounts of the SBS. It was rather, I think, a sense of a job that needed to be done. The war needed to be won and somebody had to do it, and they were the men to do it, they felt. Lassen was a bit different in the sense that in addition to all the factors that motivated his comrades, he was also driven by anger. He was driven by a strong hatred of the Germans who had taken his country. His comrades noted this. They noted his desire to kill Germans. They didn't feel that way themselves. They killed Germans because they were at war with them, not because they particularly wanted to or hated Germans, but they did understand why Lassen might feel that way, his country being occupied. Lassen was a popular leader, but not everybody liked him. Holmes certainly did not. Holmes said about him, maybe we didn't get along because Lassen was the only man in the SBS who was even more arrogant than I was. Lassen was known to be short-tempered, violent. He hated being told off by his superiors, and sometimes when a superior did tell him off, he would take it out violently on his men. On the other hand, he was also fiercely loyal to his men. He was extremely protective. He led from the front. He shared the dangers with his men. He was generous when on leave. And even Dick Holmes had to say on one occasion, sometimes, I love that man. By the late summer of 1944, after D-Day, there wasn't so much a need to make the Germans believe something great was going to happen in Crete and in Greece. And so the SBS was moved to Italy to carry out operations in Yugoslavia with a view to blocking the Germans' way out of Greece and back to Central Europe. They moved to Bari in southern Italy, and from there Lassen led an operation into Croatia, blowing up a railway bridge near Dubrovnik. But that was his only operation in Yugoslavia. He then moved back to Greece with part of the SBS. On this map, please notice Comacchio in the northern end of Italy, just south of Venice. We'll get back to Comacchio, of course. During the autumn of 44, Lassen and his SBS unit, as I said, returned to Greece, spearheading the British advance north through Greece by sailing up along the coast towards Thessaloniki. The Germans were pulling out, and the SBS's job was to slow them down to establish a British military presence in the void left by the Germans, and also to make the communist partisans, the Greek communist partisans, believe that a great British invasion would take place in the northern part of Greece, and thus discouraging any ideas the Russians might be entertaining about invading Greece from Bulgaria. That's the part of the operation which Lassen's Greek interpreter, Jason Mavridis, called the Great Bluff. Lassen led the first British forces to enter Thessaloniki before the real British forces could arrive. Just as the Germans moved out, Lassen moved in and maintained a British presence in the city, which was otherwise ruled by Greek communist partisans. After a short period of leave in Athens, Lassen was given command of a makeshift force called Cent-Force on Crete, where the 12,000 German troops had retreated into fortified positions in the northwestern part of the island. Cent-Force was to keep the Germans in place, to protect the British SOE missions on Crete, and try to keep the various Greek factions from fighting each other, and to keep the communists from seizing power. This was a political, diplomatic, policing job for which Lassen and his men had had no training and were not prepared. They got caught between different opposing factions, and they were seen in many cases as the enemy by the locals, which Lassen felt grossly unfair. It was an unhappy time for the SBS, and it even cost the SBS a couple of casualties. So Lassen and his men were pleased when they were deployed back to Italy and allowed to revert to a raiding role instead of trying to be policemen. And now they were needed in a scouting and supporting role to assist the 8th Army's advance along the east coast of Italy. They were deployed to the southern coast of Lake Comacchio and the flat landscape around the lake, which had been flooded by the Germans to block the Allied advance. From the southern shore of the lake and from 4 small islands in the middle of the lake, the SBS carried out reconnaissance, scouting, and pinprick attacks along the north, east, and west shores of the lake. The main purpose was to make the Germans believe that the Allies would attack across the lake and along the spit being 3 strips of land dividing the lake from the Adriatic Sea. These 3 strips were divided by water and flooded, muddy land. And of course, the real attack was going to take place much further inland, but the Germans were to believe that the British would attack across the lake and along the spit. And that was the SBS's job, to create that impression. The 8th Army's attack would be launched in the early hours of the 9th of April. During the night leading up to that, Lassen was to land with 17 men, approximately here at the position of the cross, just outside of Comacchio, and advance towards the town, not to take Comacchio, but simply to be seen, to make noise, and to give the impression that the attack would come here and not further inland. Here we have a view of the spit looking northwards along the central of the 3 strips of land with Comacchio on the horizon. On the left we have the westernmost strip where Lassen and his men landed, somewhere up towards Comacchio. And here again we are looking up along the westernmost strip of land, Comacchio in the background, and we see a number of German fortified positions, pillboxes they are called in the reports. And Lassen and his men landed on the western side of the strip of land we are looking at, and they landed in the dark, climbed the steep, muddy banks, and began moving towards Comacchio. They were almost immediately seen or heard by a German sentry. A firefight broke out. Several raiders were wounded. 1 or 2 may have been killed even as early as this. Lassen managed to drive his men on, and single-handedly he forced the crew of the closest of a series of pillboxes to surrender. He then moved on, attacked a second pillbox, again killing or taking prisoners the machine gun crew, and as he approached a third pillbox, whose crew had indicated that they wanted to surrender, Lassen was shot and mortally wounded. We don't know exactly what happened. We don't know where the shots came from the pillbox itself or from somewhere out in the dark. The reports disagree, and there's no way of knowing exactly what really happened. In any case, the report of the attack was broken off. In a way, it had served its purpose. Lassen and the dead and missing were left behind. A boat was also left behind and later used by the missing men to get away. The bodies of Lassen, Hughes and Roberts were collected by the local priest and some women who helped him, carried into the town and buried there. Crouch's body was only found and recovered later on. This photo shows the old cemetery inside Comacchio where the three men were initially buried. Today, this site is the playground of a municipal nursery school. The bodies were later moved to the Argenta Gap War Cemetery, which contains the graves of 648 Commonwealth servicemen who were killed in the area. Lassen's death was shocking to many of his comrades, especially perhaps to David Sutherland, who was a close friend of his and who said about him, "We thought him to be completely indestructible." Sutherland collected eyewitness accounts about what had happened the night of the 9th of April. He wrote a recommendation, he secured the necessary signatures, and shortly after VE Day he got in his jeep somewhere close to Ravenna, close to the Comacchio Lake, and then drove all the way up to Klagenfurt in Austria to visit 8th Army headquarters to present the case for a Victoria Cross for Anders Lassen based on his last fight. This was not without difficulties because Lassen was a foreigner and because the special forces were not all that popular in Whitehall. However, in December 1945, Lassen's parents, Susanne and Emil, and Lassen's sister, Bente, went to Buckingham Palace to receive Anders' Victoria Cross. Susanne, who was a very talented and very popular writer and illustrator of children's books, advertised in British newspapers to get in touch with people who had known her son during the war. She got a lot of reactions, and she also traveled to Italy and to Greece together with Bente, visiting the places where Anders had fought and talking to people who had met him. She collected a lot of material, which she used to write a book which was published in Danish in 1949 and in English in 1962. It's a very fine and very moving book, which contributed greatly to creating the lasting interest in her son. Now, to end, back at Comacchio, I said the monument was inaugurated in 2002, almost 20 years ago, but it's still an important site of remembrance in the local area. Local authorities honor Lassen and his three fallen comrades on Italy's Liberation Day, 25 of April, every year. British delegations go there from time to time, and on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of Lassen's death, a detachment of the Danish Home Guard Company from Faxe Haslev, close to Bækkeskov, where Lassen grew up, traveled to Comacchio to honor him, and again with the participation of the British Defence Attaché. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. I wanted to show you a slide saying any questions, but somehow I lost it. Anyway, are there any questions at this point?
Thomas, if I may, it's Wayne. Thomas, thank you very much indeed for a very clear and interesting presentation. And obviously, in your book, you go into far more detail you can possibly convey in such a short presentation. But you very successfully balance, I think, the rather fascinating detail about the man himself, Anders Lassen, with the context of the development of special forces taking place during the war.
Thank you.
And I really want to start on that point, before we turn to questions from the audience, I wondered if you could just comment further about, particularly as you mentioned at the end, the Whitehall dislike or lack of tolerance for special forces, why you thought that special forces mattered. What was their importance during the war, given that a lot of their actions, as you describe, were usually away from mainland Europe, on the periphery of the main effort in beating Germany, and could be seen as a distraction?
Well, I think they were important for various reasons. One of them was that they could go where nobody else could go. They could go far behind the German lines, as the SAS did in North Africa, attacking airfields, or they could go far into the Aegean in Greece, as the SBS did, and thereby, they could attack key targets, which they did in some cases, and they could, which the SBS did constantly, create diversions, which were important. I think one of the things which fascinate me about Lassen and the SBS is that in so many cases, what they really did was so much more important than what they knew about. I mean, the operations in Crete were not about blowing up aircraft. That would just be a bonus. If they could kill some Germans and destroy some aircraft, that would be excellent. But the point was not that. The point was to prepare for an invasion of Sicily, which neither Lassen nor any of these SBS people on Crete knew anything about, by distracting the Germans. That was, I think, extremely important.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. I don't think, I think you've got a, I think we're all supportive of that, but it's certainly interesting to see that that development and put it in the context of the overall effort that was going on. Now, if we may, we'll turn to questions from the audience. And Gunnar, could you please put up the first question that we've had, please?
Absolutely. We got one question here that was sent to us in advance. Why did it matter to have special forces at all, given that their actions were away from mainland Europe and could be perceived as not much more than a distraction from the main efforts in beating the Germans?
The good thing is, Gunnar, we've just answered that question. So I think we can move straight on to the next question. Bit of a bang there.
Sorry, I'm working a bit of technology at the same time here.
Thank you very much.
This one maybe then work.
Why produce your book now? Am I concerned that people in Denmark, Britain, and elsewhere are starting to forget Lassen and those like him who gave so much to achieve the freedom we enjoy today? Well, I think there is a certain loss of historic memory. A lot of people, I think for a lot of people, World War II is beginning to fade into a sort of generic a long time ago, along with World War I and whatever happened before that. On the other hand, there's also a great deal of interest about World War II. Lots of books come out, mine and many others, films are being made all the time. So in that sense, I'm not so afraid of people forgetting World War II. I may be afraid of World War II turning into myth. As I said in the beginning of my presentation, I am very keen on preserving the history of World War II, of what those people did. I mean, they deserve to be remembered, and they deserve to be remembered as real people who did real things, not just as people we tell stories about or make feature films about, but real people who lived real lives. And that was important to me.
Yeah. And I think we all, certainly of an older generation, understand that, and particularly maybe those of us who have served in the military, who sometimes we forget that these are people. They're not myths, they are people doing extraordinary things. And thank you very much for that explanation. Gunnar, could we move on now to the next question?
Absolutely. We got one from Karen Clark here. What was the connection with Glenfinnigan in Scotland, where a memorial bench is placed? Would you know that, Thomas?
As far as I know, Glenfinnan in Scotland is a commando memorial. And even though the Raiders and the SBS were not technically commandos, they trained in those same areas. So as far as I understand it, the Glenfinnan Memorial is a sort of generic, or it's seen as a sort of generic memorial to commandos and special forces. And that, I think, would be the reason for the bench being there. But it's my guess more than something I know.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would make
Very
sense. Go to the next question, please.
Yeah. Then we got one from Julian here. Can I ask whether Anders Lassen was ever commended in his letter about the main differences he noticed between the Danish and the British psyche?
He wrote about, not in a letter, but in his diary, he wrote about his admiration for the British. He spent some time in hospital in Britain, and he shared a room with people who had been wounded during the Blitz, and he commented on the stamina of the British and the courage he saw around him. And at another point of the war, he expressed great anger with the Danes. People in Denmark just going on with their lives in spite of the German occupation, not fighting the Germans while he was fighting, and while the British were fighting, the Danes in Denmark were not fighting, apart from a very, very few. That he expressed with some force.
Thomas, just before the next question, just to make the point, Thomas is not coming up on the main screen, just so you're aware, when he's talking. So at the moment, we can't see Thomas when he's answering a question. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. For some reason, Thomas's video feed is not coming through, hence why the slide you see there at the moment.
Yeah.
Please do let the other questions come in. If you have questions, you're in the top right-hand corner of your screen. You will see a potential to put your question through there. So send them through to me now while we still have time. Moving on to the next one. We have one here. You may already have answered it initially, Thomas, to begin with. I understand that Anders was a crack shot with a crossbow, but the powers that banned him from taking it onto operations, is it true, or do you have any further details on this?
Not a crossbow, as far as I know. He was a great shot with bow and arrow. He liked to hunt with bow and arrow, and while he was with the small-scale raiding force, he even sent in a proposition to the British War Office explaining why they should teach British soldiers and special forces to use bow and arrow. And the War Office responded by sending him a set of 2 bows and arrows for him to train with, but decided that it was not for them. I think it was perhaps considered too difficult to teach soldiers to use bow and arrow, and I think it was also considered uncivilized and not a proper way of waging war. So he never used bow and arrow in action.
Interesting.
Yes,
Yeah.
I must admit, in terms of, there's an infringement, the sort of close quarter options of a bow and arrow, which I think in the book, where you quote the case that he put forward, as very articulate, and I think in his belief, his real enthusiasm, as well as his personal skill in fire and maneuver, to use something so obvious, so successfully in quiet kills, was quite fantastic. It's the sort of thing which Whitehall would never agree to. I cannot believe Whitehall is ever going to be that forward thinking in its behaviour. Anyway, Gunnar, please, the next question.
Yes, comes here from Paul. Was Anders Lassen's story publicized in Denmark during the war by way of inspiration to the Danish people?
Not that I know of. I know he was featured in some British and maybe American magazines during the war. He was interviewed. I've been trying to get hold of copies of those magazines. I haven't succeeded yet. And of course, theoretically, those magazines might have found their way to Denmark. But as far as I know, he wasn't mentioned in the illegal press or in dispatches from London. And actually, very little wasn't heard from him. At all. He spent all his time fighting in Greece or in Italy or in the Middle East, and he didn't get back to London or to Britain after January 1943. He was very publicized right after the war. A book came out in 1947 and some radio talks and newspaper articles, but not during the war, not as far as I know, at least.
Okay. Very good.
Good. Next question, please.
We have a question here from Colin, and Colin sent it in earlier as well, but he reiterated it here, and I think, Thomas, you already had a look at it. Might I ask what the information might have on Martin Solomon? My father was in SIS, and they were first cousins. I have also photo and family of album, Adrian Seligman.
This
Go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, Martin Solomon and Seligman, that's extremely interesting. I'd like you actually, Colin, to email me. My email is at the beginning of the presentation and it's very easy to find because I'm in touch with somebody who is researching the life of Martin Solomon and maybe writing a book about him, and that would be an interesting connection for you to make. But it's a bit complicated and we can't go into it now. It's too much detail, but please get in touch. And in general, if anybody has any questions for me which we cannot answer now because we are short on time, you're welcome to get in touch. Also, any new information is most welcome.
I think we have room for one last question here from Rupert. Was Lassen the only non-Commonwealth citizen to win the Victoria Cross, or did he have British citizenship?
Lassen did not have British citizenship, and he was not the only non-Commonwealth citizen to win a VC. I'm afraid that it says so actually on the back of one of the first editions of my book, and it may even have said so on my homepage at some point. And then it dawned on me that a number of Gurkha soldiers from Nepal won the VC, and Nepal was not part of the Commonwealth, and there may have been other non-Commonwealth soldiers as well who won the VC. But let's say that Lassen was one of the few non-Commonwealth soldiers who won the VC.
Gunnar, if we've run out of time, that's fine. I should just say as well that I think the question of his winning, I think the unique thing is that he was a European who won the Victorian Cross, and he wasn't sort of part of the normal order of battle for the British Army. So I think he was unique in that sense. And of course, quite right too. I think at least somebody therefore did do the right thing. Although we've run out of time, Thomas, I just want to pass on my thanks for your presentation this evening, for being able to give us an insight into your book on Anders Lassen. And I'll leave my last comment to quote from the British Chief of the General Staff again in his foreword, as he says that the book is a magisterial account of a young, heroic Dane at war. And having read the book, it really is a brilliant read. And thank you very much for giving us some insight to that this evening. And Gunnar, can I hand back to you to close the proceedings?
Absolutely. Thank you very much to Thomas as well from me, and Wayne very much for moderating it very well here. I'm sorry to disappoint all the ones who have asked questions here. For sure there are more to come, and as Thomas hinted already, we'll try to follow up on them separate. So I'll share the questions with Thomas and we'll try to field the responses back to you individually. But with this final slide here on behalf of Anglo-Danish Society and the Danish-UK Association, and indeed all the supporting organizations and individuals who have helped to spread the word and make this event possible, thank you so much. There are things coming up for the ones who are in Britain. I can highly recommend Anglo-Danish Society and the Danish-UK Association. We're teamed up and are hosting Pinsefrokost, celebrating with sun, and we do so on the 28th of May. At an Ekta Nordic Kitchen in central London. So please do join in and let's get out and meet a little bit in good company. But with this, thank you very much everyone, for everyone who tuned into this. The recording will be sent out to you shortly within about an hour or two. Enjoy and do look us all up again. Thank you. Have a good evening all.